and welcome to KU Padasala. I am Dr. Sarita ji. In this segment, I shall be trying to cover part of Module 1 from the core course titled British Literature I from the syllabus of 3rd BA, English Language and Literature. The modules are divided on the basis of different literary periods in British history. The first module is titled Pre-Elizabethan Literature. I hope to take you through the important events, different trends, and also speak about the representative writers and their works. My lecture will not include a discussion of the text prescribed for study. I will give the literary background for the study of the text. The topics covered in this segment would be Anglo-Saxon literature, Bede, Beowulf, King Alfred, Norman conquest, and ballads. The remaining topics will be covered in the next segment. To start with, I would like to give you an account of the historical background of British literature. Please take a look at the timeline. It was between 800 and 600 BC that the two groups of Celts from southern Europe invaded the British Isles. The group that settled down on the largest island, Britain, called themselves Britons or Britons, and the other group who settled down in Ireland came to be called the Gaels. It was from Britons that the island got its name. By the 1st century BC, Rome had already become a mighty empire and had extended its influence throughout the Mediterranean region. In 55 BC and 54 BC, Julius Caesar, the great Roman general and statesman, led expeditions to Britain, and his successors were able to achieve a complete conquest and subjugation of the Celtic rulers. Roman rule lasted for 300 years, and by the end of the 2nd century, the Britons had become thoroughly Romanized. However, the Roman legions withdrew from Britain in AD 407 when the northern European tribes began to attack the Roman Empire in Italy. The Roman rule in Britain thus came to an abrupt end in 4th century AD. It was by the end of the 3rd century that the barbarians, Goths, Franks, Vandals, Angles and Saxons started making inroads into Gaul, Spain, Italy and Britain. The Germanic people, they are also called the Teutonic people, they were the Indo-European speakers of Germanic languages. Saxons conquered a considerable portion of the country, and hence we have such place names like Sussex, Wessex, Middlesex, Essex and so on. Angles were another Teutonic tribe, and they occupied East Anglia, Norfolk and Suffolk. In AD 827, King Egbert first named the island England, the land of the Anglo-Saxons. Britain thus became England. They came to be the Britons who survived. They escaped to the west of the country and took shelter there. They came to be called Welsh, and Wales became their country. Thus, it is the Low Germanic language that became Anglo-Saxon or Old English. The heroic deeds of King Arthur are supposed to have taken place during the struggle between the Britons and the Anglo-Saxons. The Angles, Saxons and Jutes were three kindred tribes, and they were thorough barbarians with absolutely no respect for the civilized. They were heathens worshipping myriads of gods. They succeeded in almost completely obliterating all aspects of Romano-British civilization. Now we will discuss Anglo-Saxon literature or Old English literature, that is from 7th century to 11th century AD. So even amidst all these troubles, learning continued to flourish, particularly in the monasteries. In fact, the monks and the higher clergy were the only educated men, and the monopoly of learning was held by the monks. The monasteries of Jarrow and Whitby in Northumbria were the famous centers of Old English literature. Some of the greatest scholars of Europe were produced in the English monasteries of the 8th century, and the most famous of them was the venerable Bede, who was a Benedictine monk at the monastery of St. Peter and its companion monastery, St. Paul in Jerome in the kingdom of Northumbria of the Angles. He was the greatest of England's Latin scholars, and he lived between 673 AD and 735 AD. He was one of the greatest scholars of the Anglo-Saxon period, and he produced a large number of works on different subjects as varied as science, music, poetry, and even biblical commentary. His masterpiece, Historia Ecclesiastica Gentis Anglorum, that is, which translates into English as the ecclesiastical history of the English people, entitles him to be called the father of English history. It was composed in Latin and is believed to have been completed when Bede was 59 years old. His greatest pleasure, as he himself says, was in learning, teaching, and writing. He toiled at these till the day of his death. In fact, it is believed that he dictated the last sentence in the translation of St. John's Gospel and quietly breathed his last. It is considered one of the most important original references on Anglo-Saxon history and has played a key role in the development of English national identity. While Bede also provides an in-depth history of England up to his own lifetime, his main focus was on the spread of Christianity in his native country. The major subject of Bede's history is the growth of the church in England, that is Anglo-Saxon kingdoms up to the 8th century AD. Religious figures and events throughout this period are described in great detail. The lives and careers of secular rulers are also recounted. Bede pays particular attention to the rivalry between the Rome-centered church practice and Celtic Christian communities, which had been present in Britain and Ireland for centuries before the arrival of the Anglo-Saxons. Bede's work is considered one of the most important sources of Anglo-Saxon history for modern-day scholarship. It is a major source for political, social, and religious history in England during the early Anglo-Saxon age. Earlier, all prose writings, all important prose written in the British Isles were composed in Latin, as the vernacular or the language of the common people was considered a vulgar tongue. Anglo-Saxon literature or Old English literature is the earliest form of English literature, and it includes spoken verse and incantations on ceremonial occasions. Anglo-Saxon poetry developed in the north, and Anglo-Saxon prose, which was not of much value, were developed in the south. As the Anglo-Saxons were a singing folk, Anglo-Saxon verse preceded Anglo-Saxon prose, and the warlike Anglo-Saxons, they were fond of tales of battles. The Anglo-Saxon poetry was characterized by a love for adventure, martial spirit, and also fondness for sea. You can see the martial spirit in war poetry, especially in the work, the Battle of Brunanburh, which was composed in 937 AD. Old English prosody was different from the modern, that is, lines are not grouped into stanzas and they run consecutively. Rhyme is absent, but there is regular alliteration. Anglo-Saxon poetry employed beginning rhyme instead of end rhyme. It has irregular lines with regard to unaccented syllables. Each line is divided into two parts. The first has two accented syllables and the second has at least one, and they are rhythmically connected by alliteration and stress. The poets also used a lot of metaphorical phrases and compound words. It is possible to identify two categories of Anglo-Saxon poetry: the heroic poetry and the elegiac tradition. Heroic poetry tells about the achievements of warriors, and elegiac tradition laments either the death of a lover or sometimes even loss of the past. Next, we will discuss a very important work, Beowulf. Beowulf is the most important poem in Old English. It is the first major poem in European vernacular language. The poem gives an interesting picture of the life of the Anglo-Saxons in the early days of their history. The memory of Beowulf has stood strong through all ages as Britain's first epic. The long poem Beowulf is the most famous example of heroic poetry. This Old English poem of 3182 lines is generally dated in 750 AD. The authorship is not known, and its history still remains a matter of controversy. The story was in all probability brought from their homelands in Denmark and Sweden in the form of a ballad, and later it was fashioned into an epic by some Northumbrian poet. The work is manifestly heathen in origin, but it might have been composed by some Christian author. The historical period of the events mentioned in the poem can be dated in the 6th century, and a copy of it written in 1000 AD is the most precious relic of Old English. Beowulf tells of three major events in the life of the Geatish hero Beowulf from a region that is today southern Sweden. The first event was when in his youth he fights and kills Grendel, a monster who had been attacking Heorot, the banquet hall of the Danish king Hrothgar. And the second event is when he kills Grendel's mother, his mother, who comes next to avenge her son. 50 years later, Beowulf, who had been for a long time the king of Geats, fights the dragon of the Gold Hoard and kills him single-handedly. But then he gets mortally wounded in the combat and he succumbs to it soon after. The poem ends with Beowulf's funeral rites that show the high loyalty of the Thanes to their lord, and also the generosity of the king to his people. The scenes and the people of the epic are Scandinavian, but Beowulf embodies the English ideal of courage and nobility. What Achilles is to the Greek, Romulus to the Roman, Charlemagne to the French, Beowulf is to the Englishman. Beside him, King Arthur is but a shadowy figure. Beowulf records the dreams, aspirations, and also the fears of the Anglo-Saxon. Most of the Old English poems, Widsith, Genesis, Exodus, Daniel, Christ and Satan, they are all biblical in theme as they were composed after the conversion. Exeter book, the largest surviving collection of Old English poetry, the manuscript was given to Exeter Cathedral by Bishop Leofric. It begins with some long religious poems like the Christ in 3 parts, two poems on Saint Guthlac, the fragmentary Azarius, and the allegorical Phoenix. Following these are a number of shorter religious verses intermingled with poems of types that have survived only in this codex. Widsith is probably the oldest poem in the language. Old English poem probably from the 7th century that is preserved in the Exeter book, a 10th century collection of Old English poetry. It is an idealized self-portrait of a minstrel of the Germanic heroic age who wandered widely and was welcomed in many kingdoms. Widsith translates as the traveler's song. it has 143 lines, and it survives only in the Exeter. In fact, the Exeter book contains approximately 1/6 of all surviving Old English poetry. It is this poem is for the most part a survey of the people, kings and heroes of Europe in the heroic age of Northern Europe. Now, the oldest extant work that gives a historical account of the battle of the Goths and the Huns, recounted as legends in later Scandinavian works. All the extant Anglo-Saxon lyrics, or elegies as they are usually called, the wanderer, the seafarer, the wife's lament, the husband's message, and the ruin, they're all found here. These are secular poems evoking a poignant sense of desolation and loneliness in their description of the separation of lovers, the sorrows of exile, or terrors and attractions of the sea. Some of them, particularly poems like The Wanderer and The Seafarer, they carry the weight of a religious allegory. In addition, the Exeter book also preserves 95 riddles, a genre that would otherwise have been represented by a solitary example. Some of the notable poets who rose to prominence after the conversion of Anglo-Saxons to Christianity are: one is Caedmon. Caedmon was a monk at the monastery of Whitby in Yorkshire. He was a lay brother. He was believed to have been divinely inspired, and Bede mentions in his ecclesiastical history that he was an illiterate lay brother in the monastery of Whitby, and he came to possess his poetic gift after an angel appeared before him in a dream and asked him to sing in praise of God. The only work attributed to Caedmon is the short Hymn of Creation, which is a 9-line alliterative vernacular poem praising God. He now stands at the top of the English literary tradition as the initial Anglo-Saxon or Old English poet of record. Now, the poet Beowulf, he was a wandering gleeman and a lover of pleasure. He had a vision of the Holy Cross and began to compose religious songs. He is the author of 4 Old English poems preserved in the late 10th century manuscripts. Aline and The Fate of the Apostles are in the Vercelli book, and The Ascension and Juliana are in the Exeter book. The Dream of the Rood is his masterpiece and contains a description of the poet's vision of the Holy Cross, the incident that changed his life. King Alfred the Great. King Alfred was a great patron of learning. He collected the laws of the country and also caused them to be written down. He founded schools, restored monasteries. He brought scholars from France and Germany to educate his subjects. He has himself translated many of the important works from Latin to English. Alfred was until recently considered to have been the author of many of the translations, but this is now considered doubtful in almost all cases. Some scholars often refer to these translations as Alfredian, indicating that they probably had something to do with his patronage, but they're not likely to be his works. Alfred undoubtedly translated 4 works himself: Gregory the Great's Pastoral Care, Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, St. Augustine's Soliloquies, and the first 50 Psalms of the Psalter. Old English versions of Orosius's Histories Against the Pagans and Bede's Ecclesiastical History of the English People are no longer accepted as Alfred's own translations because of lexical and also stylistic differences. Nevertheless, they might have been definitely part of the Alfredian program of translation. It is also important to mention the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which is a collection of annals in Old English, and it chronicles the history of the Anglo-Saxons, and it is considered the first history of the Germanic people up to 1154 AD. The original manuscript of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle was created late in the 9th century, probably during the reign of King Alfred the Great. So it can be said that King Alfred was definitely the guiding spirit behind the compilation of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. Two important writers of Old English period were Alfred, who was a monk who wrote sermons in English. His famous homilies were among the best examples of Saxon prose. The first series of 40 homilies devote itself to the major events of the Christian year, and the second series deals with Christian doctrine and history. Wulfstan, the Archbishop of York, was one of the most distinguished of prose writers. In 1014, as Archbishop, he wrote his famous work, Sermon of the Wolf, which is an indictment of Ethelred's inability to check the Danes. He is accused of cowardice and unpreparedness in defending England. We now come to the Norman conquest. The conquest of England by the Norman French happened in 1066 under William, the Duke of Normandy, a province of France. The Battle of Hastings was fought on 14th October 1066, and the battle was between the Norman army of the Duke William of Normandy and an English army under King Harold. It lasted all day, and it was a very bloody battle, even by medieval standards. Eventually, Harold was killed and the English fled, and thus the way was open for William to assume the throne of England. Ballads. Medieval ballads were short, anonymous, narrative poems or songs which have been preserved and elaborated by oral transmission over the centuries, and they were intended to be sung to the accompaniment of music. They might have been passed from one country to another with suitable modifications also. The traditional ballad had no single author. Rather, it was the product of many poets, and they were produced by the common people and mostly recited or sung in the market square, in alehouses or at fairs. It had no written form, and it underwent a lot of changes or modifications during the course of time due to new circumstances and conditions. And because of their highly mutable oral form, it is almost impossible to date some of the ballads. They had a simple musical rhymed meter. They were composed in short stanzas of about 2 or 4 lines, and they were sung to simple instrumental accompaniment. These ballads, they were usually written in simple quatrains, 4-line stanzas with a repeated refrain. Refrain is a repetition of lines, either one line or sometimes even more. They're simple in form, plot and language, in order to make it easier for people to memorize. The use of colloquial language was yet another indispensable feature of the ballads. They used day-to-day common words or stock phrases. They were all easy to memorize, and sometimes a story is even told through dialogues. Ballads usually have an abrupt and unexpected opening. They don't provide any details about the subject matter, the surroundings, atmosphere, or the environment. The ending of the ballads may also be abrupt and unexpected. Motives are not explained, and sometimes there is also the presence of supernatural elements in them. The content of a ballad often involves love and death, battles, adventures, journey involving risks, and so on. Ballads can be classified in different categories. There are the border ballads, ballads of outlaws, ballads of magic, town ballads, etc. Border ballads often told stories about the rivalry between the English and Scottish people. Ballads of outlaws celebrate the lives of criminals, like for example Robin Hood, who lived in the woods with his band of merry men, robbing the rich and also helping the poor. The Ballad of Magic tells stories about fairies, witches, ghosts, and then there are the ballads of love and domestic tragedy, the town ballads that served as a commentary on urban conditions. Lord Randall is a traditional Scottish ballad. It tells the sad story of a noble called Lord Randall. It was probably derived from the Middle Ages. Geordie is a famous English ballad which presents a rather complex narrative. It is a traditional ballad concerning the trial of a young man who has stolen deers from the king's land. It is a serious crime that will lead him to death penalty, notwithstanding his wife's pleas for his life. The date of composition is not known. It may be dated to the late Middle Ages. It is still widely known today and often sung in traditional as well as modernized versions. There are many different versions of ballads, and they've been sung by traditional folk singers in Scotland, England, Ireland, Canada, and even United States. So now that brings us to the end of this segment. Remember, this is just part of the first module. The second segment will cover the remaining topics from this module. Thank you so much for listening.